A German soldier could survive artillery, hunger, and freezing trenches, yet still be broken by a tiny aircraft he could barely hear. The Night Witches did not need giant bombers to terrify Nazi soldiers. They used old Po-2 planes, darkness, silence, and repetition to turn sleep into something dangerous. Each time the engine faded, men below had only seconds to wonder if the bomb was already falling. Tonight, we follow the young Soviet women who made the night itself feel unsafe. So, before you settle in, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of slow war history is something you truly enjoy. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. It is always strange and wonderful to know that people from different places are listening to the same dark piece of history at the same time. Now, lower the lights, get comfortable, and let the night become still around you. Let's step carefully into this story together tonight. The trench was quiet, but no one inside it felt safe. A few German soldiers lay under thin blankets, with their boots still on and their rifles close enough to grab in the dark. The small fire near the dugout had almost gone out, leaving only a weak orange glow on the mud, the sandbags, and the tired faces of men who had not slept properly for many nights. Above them, the sky looked empty. Then a thin engine sound appeared. At first, it was easy to miss. It did not sound like a heavy bomber or a powerful fighter crossing the front. It was light, uneven, and almost fragile, like a machine that should not have belonged in the middle of a war. But the men in the trench still lifted their heads, because by that point they had learned that small sounds at night could be more dangerous ones. The sound came closer. Night changed the body of a soldier. In daylight, a man could see the ground, the wire, the trees, the smoke, and the faces of the men beside him. At night, everything became guesswork. Cold slowed the hands, lack of sleep dulled the mind, and every little sound seemed to carry a warning. A branch moving in the wind could wake a man. A distant footstep could make him reach for his weapon. A low engine above the clouds could tighten the whole trench. This was how fear worked. The soldiers did not need to see the aircraft to know what it might be. Stories had already moved through the German lines about small Soviet planes that came in the dark, dropped bombs, and disappeared before the defenders could properly react. These were not huge aircraft that shook the sky with engines. They were light, slow, and easy to underestimate when described in daylight. At night, that weakness became harder to laugh at. It is almost ridiculous that a front line full of armed men could be kept awake by a plane that sounded like an old farm machine. But war often made ridiculous things deadly. The men knew that a weapon did not need to look impressive to hurt them. A small bomb could still tear through a tent, break a crate of supplies, kill a horse, wound a sleeping man, or throw enough dirt into a trench to turn rest into panic. The body did not care whether the aircraft above it was modern or old. It only cared where the bomb landed. Then the engine stopped. That was the worst moment. The sound did not fade because the danger had passed. It vanished because the aircraft had cut its noise and was gliding closer in the dark. The soldiers understood this without needing anyone to explain it. One man pressed his back against the trench wall. Another lowered his helmet and stared upward. Someone held his breath for a few seconds, as if breathing too loudly might give the plane a target. The silence felt heavier than the engine. This fear became tied to the Soviet women, later known as the Night Witches. They belonged to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, which was later honoured as the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Their aircraft were small and their bombs were not the largest weapons of the war, but their method was simple and cruelly effective. They came at night. often when soldiers were exhausted, cold, and desperate for sleep. They attacked the rest itself. A bomb landed beyond the trench line. The blast was not large enough to destroy the whole position, but it was close enough to shake loose dirt from the wall and send men down into the mud. A tin cup rolled near someone's boot. A blanket slipped from a sleeping place. A horse cried out behind the line, and men started moving before they fully understood what had happened. Someone checked the ammunition boxes. Someone looked toward the supply area. Someone cursed under his breath. No one slept after that. This was the real power of the attack. It did not need to wipe out an entire unit. It only needed to keep the unit awake, tense, and unable to recover before morning. A tired soldier became slower. He missed details. He grew angrier more quickly. His hands shook when he cleaned his weapon. His eyes burned when he tried to watch the line. By the next day, he might still be alive. But he was not the same man who had lain down the night before. Today, a broken night of sleep might ruin a workday, but on a wartime front line, it could ruin a man's chance of staying alive. A soldier needed rest to think clearly, follow orders, watch for danger, and control fear. When sleep disappeared, everything else became harder. The body remained in the trench, but the mind began to wear down. One night was bad. Many nights became a kind of slow damage. The men began to fear the gaps between sounds. A loud engine at least gave them something to follow. Silence gave them nothing. It could mean the plane had turned away. It could mean the plane was right above them. It could mean a bomb had already been released and was falling through the dark. That uncertainty made the waiting worse than the blast. I find it chilling that the explosion lasted only a moment, while the fear of hearing another engine could last until sunrise. That was what made these night attacks different from a single strike in daylight. The soldiers could not relax after one bomb, because another plane might come from a different direction. They could not trust the quiet after the engine stopped. They could not even trust the sky when it looked empty. The trench settled again, but only on the surface. Men pulled their blankets back over their shoulders and tried to lie down, though their bodies remained ready to move. The fire was almost dead now, and the mud around it looked black and cold. Somewhere above them the plane had gone, or another one was circling, or nothing at all was there. The men had no way to know. That was the punishment. By morning, the trench still existed. The position had not been erased from the map, and most of the men were still alive. But the night had taken something useful from them. It had taken sleep, calm, and the simple belief that darkness meant rest. The engine had vanished in the dark, but the fear it left behind stayed with the men long after the small bomb fell. To understand where that fear came from, the story has to move from the German trench to the Soviet field base where the pilots prepared for the next night. There, young women in oversized coats stood beside old aircraft, getting ready to make grown men at the front fear the sound of silence. At the Soviet field base, the night did not begin when the sun disappeared. It began earlier, when the ground crews checked the small aircraft, when the pilots pulled on heavy coats, and when the cold settled into the mud around the wheels. The women standing beside the planes looked young, and many of them were young, with their hair hidden under flight caps, and their faces already trained not to show too much fear. Their boots were dirty, their sleeves were too large, and their eyes were fixed on the work ahead. They did not look like a legend. The aircraft beside them were not grand machines. They were small, light, and plain, with fabric wings, open cockpits, and the kind of shape that made them look closer to training planes than weapons that could disturb an enemy army. A person seeing them in daylight might have wondered how submachines could frighten soldiers at the front. They did not carry the weight of modern bombers, and they did not have the speed of fighters. They looked fragile. That was part of the story. The Soviet Union was fighting a war of survival, and survival did not allow every job to be done by the strongest men with the newest equipment. The front needed pilots, mechanics, navigators, radio operators, drivers, medics, and countless others who could keep the war moving under terrible pressure. Women entered many of these roles, not as decoration, but because the country needed hands, skill, discipline, and courage wherever it could find them. Aviation was no exception. Marina Raskova played an important role in making that possible. She was already a famous Soviet aviator, and she helped push for the creation of women's aviation units during the war. Because of efforts like hers, young women who might once have been told to stay far from combat were brought into military flying. They were trained, organized, and sent toward danger with a task that sounded simple on paper: fly at night, find the enemy, drop bombs, return, and do it again. It was never simple. It is almost bitterly funny that the same war machine that doubted these women still expected them to climb into old aircraft at night and make the enemy lose sleep. They were not handed the most powerful planes in the sky. They were not protected by comfort, ease, or much room for error. They had to work with what they were given, and what they were given was often limited, old, and physically punishing. That meant every success had to be earned the hard way. The field base itself was rough. Mud stuck to boots and wheels. Fuel cans stood near the aircraft. Bombs waited to be fixed under the wings. Mechanics worked in the cold with numb fingers, while pilots checked straps, maps, watches, and small details that could decide whether a flight ended on the runway or on enemy ground. Nothing around them looked clean or heroic. It looked like work. That is what made them dangerous. They did not need to appear terrifying at the airfield. They only needed to become reliable in the dark, night after night, until German soldiers began to recognize the sound of their approach and fear the silence that followed. Their strength came from repetition, discipline, and the ability to turn a weak aircraft into a tool of pressure. A single raid might annoy the enemy. Many raids could break his rest. The women knew they were being watched. Some men doubted them openly, and others doubted them without saying anything. A woman in a flight jacket could still be treated as an exception, a risk, or a problem to be proven wrong. That kind of judgment did not stop when the engine started. It followed them into every briefing, every mistake, every landing, and every story told about whether women could really do this work. They answered by flying. Today, it would be like giving a group of underestimated young recruits outdated equipment, then asking them to perform one of the most stressful jobs in the war while everyone waits to see if they fail. That pressure did not only come from the enemy, it came from the cold, from the machines, from the commanders, from the limits of the aircraft, and from the knowledge that one bad night could confirm every insult spoken about them. They had to fight the war and the judgment around them at the same time. Their faces may have looked calm before takeoff, but calm did not mean comfort. They knew the aircraft could be hit. They knew the weather could turn. They knew the dark could hide the wrong landmark, the wrong field, or the wrong flash of light on the ground. They also knew that if they succeeded, the men in the German trenches would not see their youth, their muddy boots, or their thin faces in the cold. They would only hear the engine. Then they would hear nothing. I find it powerful that their reputation began not with huge machines or easy victories, but with young women learning to make fear out of weakness. The enemy feared them because they returned again and again. Their own side had to respect them because they kept flying when the work was cold, dangerous, and thankless. Every night turned the old aircraft into something more serious than it looked. Every mission made the joke smaller and the record harder to deny. By the time the women climbed into the cockpit, the base had already become quiet in a practical way. Ground crews stepped back. The pilot settled into position. The small aircraft faced the dark strip of field ahead, carrying a light bomb load and a heavy purpose. Behind them were mud, doubt, and tired hands. Ahead of them was the German line. The engine started. These young women were not given the strongest weapons, but they learned to turn old aircraft, cold air, and repeated night attacks into a kind of pressure the enemy could feel in his bones. To understand why that pressure worked so well, the story has to look closely at the little Polikarpov Po-2 sitting on the muddy field. It looked too slow, too simple, and too weak to become a nightmare, which is exactly why what happened next feels so strange. On the ground, the Polikarpov Po-2 did not look like something that could frighten trained soldiers. It sat on the dirt runway, with its two wings stacked above each other, its fabric skin stretched over a light frame, and its open cockpit exposed to the cold air. The wheels looked simple, the body looked narrow, and the whole aircraft seemed closer to a school machine than a weapon sent toward the front. In daylight, it looked weak. That was the mistake. The Po-2 was not built to impress anyone. It was slow, light, and basic, with a design that belonged more to training, communication, and utility work than to the kind of modern air war filled with fast fighters and heavy bombers. A soldier looking at it on a field might have thought it was too old to matter. A pilot used to stronger aircraft might have noticed every limitation at once. But war did not always reward what looked strongest. The very things that made the Po-2 unimpressive in daylight made it useful at night. It could take off and land from rough fields where heavier aircraft would struggle. It did not need a perfect runway, a grand base, or much space to begin its work. Its slow speed allowed it to fly low and carefully over dark terrain, following rivers, fields, roads, and small patches of light that helped the crew find their way. It was not elegant, but it was practical. Practice could be dangerous. It is almost funny that a plane many people might have dismissed as outdated became terrifying because it was too slow, too small, and too stubborn to behave as the aircraft German soldiers expected. A fast plane usually announced itself with speed, sound, and force. The Po-2 came differently. It moved through the dark in a way that made it hard to judge from the ground. It could seem close, then distant, then suddenly close again, especially to men who were tired, cold, and already afraid of the sky. The aircraft could not carry a heavy bomb load. That mattered. It could not smash a large target the way a bigger bomber might. It could not race away from danger like a fighter. If it was caught in the wrong light or struck by ground fire, it was fragile. Its strength did not come from one huge blow. It came from returning. A small bomb load meant more flights, more takeoffs, more landings, and more trips back toward the same kind of danger. That made the Po-2 a tool of repetition. One aircraft could take a position, another could disturb the same men later, another could force them to leave their blankets, check damage, listen again, and wonder whether the night was finished or only beginning. The physical damage could be limited, but the pressure spread wider than the crater. The plane became part of the night. From the German side, this was what made it so irritating and frightening. A soldier could hate a big bomber because it was powerful. He could understand that kind of threat. But a small, slow biplane that kept coming back felt different. It was like being denied rest by something that should have been easy to crush, but somehow remained out there in the dark. That feeling wore men down. Today, it would be like being kept awake night after night by a weak machine outside your window, except that every time the sound changed, something nearby might explode. The comparison sounds strange because modern life gives most people a clear line between annoyance and danger. At the front, there was no such line. The annoying sound could mean death. The quiet after it could be worse. The small aircraft could become larger in the mind than it looked in the field. The women who flew it understood the machine differently from the men who mocked it. They knew its weight, its limits, and its habits. They knew how it handled in cold air, how it reacted when loaded, and how much room they needed to rise from rough ground. They knew that the open cockpit would punish them with wind, and that a simple aircraft still demanded steady hands. They did not need the Po-2 to be mighty. They needed it to keep working. In the dim light before a mission, a mechanic might check the fabric wings, the wires, small bombs fixed beneath the aircraft, and the parts that could not be allowed to fail. The pilot and navigator would look over maps, timings, and landmarks. Knowing the aircraft gave them little protection if anything went wrong. The Po-2 did not hide its weakness from them. Every loose strap, every cold metal fitting, every exposed section of the cockpit reminded them what kind of machine they were trusting. They climbed in anyway. I find it unsettling that the Po-2 became frightening not by overcoming its weakness, but by using that weakness in exactly the right place, at exactly the wrong hour for the men below. In daylight, slowness could mean death. At night, slowness could become control. A low approach could confuse listeners on the ground. A small shape could be swallowed by darkness. A light aircraft could come close enough to drop its bombs and leave behind men who were more shaken than the size of the explosion could explain. That was the real reversal. The Po-2 was not a miracle aircraft. It was not invincible, and it did not make the pilots safe. It was dangerous to fly, easy to damage, and painfully limited compared with the stronger machines of the war. But in the hands of crews who understood night flying, rough airfields, and repeated harassment, it became something more than its parts. It became a problem that the enemy could not ignore. A weak plane became a hard question. For German soldiers, the Po-2 was frustrating because it did not fit their idea of a proper threat. It was too slow to respect, too persistent to dismiss, and too quiet at the worst moments to forget. It did not need to dominate the sky. It only needed to enter the night often enough that men on the ground began listening for it before they heard it. That kind of fear did not come from size. It came from expectation. The Po-2 looked weak on the runway, but in the darkness, it became a small, stubborn shadow that returned often enough to steal sleep from men who badly needed it. The next danger was not only the aircraft itself, but the way the pilots brought it toward the target in near silence. When the engine faded and the sky went quiet, German soldiers learned that the calmest moment of the night could be the moment a bomb was already falling. High above the dark front, the little Po-2 did not rush toward its target like a machine eager to be noticed. It moved through the cold night air with its engine, working just enough to carry it forward, while the pilot kept her eyes on the ground below and the navigator watched for the right moment. Under the wings, small bombs waited in the dark, and ahead of them the faint glow of German positions began to separate itself from the rest of the land. The aircraft was still there. Then the sound began to fade. From the ground, that change could feel unnatural. A German soldier listening from a trench or a dugout might first hear the thin engine and try to judge whether it was near or far, high or low, passing by or turning back. But just when his ears had fixed themselves on the noise, the sound weakened and nearly vanished, as if the sky had swallowed the plane whole. That was the point. The quiet meant danger. This was one of the most feared parts of the Night Witch's approach. As they neared the target, the pilots could reduce the engine or cut it for a short glide, letting the aircraft drift forward with much less noise. That simple act made detection harder in the final seconds before the bombs were released. A machine that had seemed present and trackable became ghost-like, leaving only the whisper of air moving across the wings. It is almost cruel that the safest sounding moment in the night could be the moment when a bomb is closest to your head. Soldiers were trained to react to noise, movement, and visible threats. Silence usually suggested that a danger had passed or had not yet arrived. But this kind of attack reversed that logic. The men on the ground learned that, when the sound died away, it was often time to flatten themselves into the earth. There was very little time. A soldier in the trench could not look up and clearly see where the plane was. He could not know whether it was lining up above his position, the supply point behind him, or the road off to the side. He had only a few seconds to guess, drop low, press against the trench wall, or throw himself toward whatever cover seemed nearest. The body reacted before the mind could do much good. That was enough. Stories about the Night Witches often described that silent glide as the detail that stayed in memory. German troops said the aircraft made a sound like a broom or a whisper moving through the dark, which helped give rise to the nickname. Whether every man heard it the same way mattered less than the result. They remembered the feeling of listening hard, hearing almost nothing, and waiting for the blast that would prove the sky was not empty at all. The attack did not need to be large to work. A small bomb exploding near a position could wake everyone, break the last thin layer of rest, and force men back into full alertness. It could scatter dirt over blankets, shake loose boards in a dugout, and leave soldiers staring upward long after the danger had passed. The body stayed tense because it had learned that the next quiet patch might hide the next glide. Today, most people hear silence as comfort. But for those soldiers, it could feel like the final pause before impact. That is what made this tactic so effective. It did not simply frighten men in a single moment. It changed the meaning of quiet itself. The night stopped being a place where the senses could recover and became a place where even stillness carried a warning. The pilot and navigator above were not performing magic. They were using a practical, simple method that fit the aircraft they had. The Po-2 was slow and light, and that slowness, which looked like a flaw in daylight, gave it a different kind of usefulness in darkness. When the engine softened and the plane slipped forward in near silence, the target below had to fear what it could not clearly locate. The uncertainty did the work. On the ground, men would hear the engine, then lose it, then wait for an explosion that might come to the left, the right, behind them, or directly above. Some would grip their helmets. Some would press themselves into the dirt. Some would try to stay calm and fail because the body could not fully obey reason after too many broken nights. Fear became compressed into a few quiet seconds. Then the bomb fell. Even after the blast, the silence continued to matter. Men who survived one pass could not be sure the plane was gone for good. Another aircraft might be behind it. The same plane might circle back later. The night itself seemed untrustworthy now, because it had already hidden one approach and could hide another. That is how a simple tactic became a psychological weapon. It stayed in the nerves. I find it chilling that these pilots not only attacked the body with bombs, but also attacked the mind by teaching exhausted men to fear the calmest part of the sky. Once that lesson settled in, every pause became suspicious. The ear kept searching for a sound that might disappear again. A soldier might survive the raid without a scratch, and still lose the rest of the night to anticipation alone. That was the larger effect. The Night Witches turned an ordinary piece of flying skill into something that felt almost unnatural from the ground. They approached quietly, struck suddenly, and left behind more than craters. They left behind a new habit of fear, one tied not just to noise, but to the moment when noise stopped. This silent approach made one raid feel larger than it was, but the true nightmare came from how often such nights repeated themselves. The story now moves from one frightening attack to the pattern that made the women so famous among German troops. Men would barely crawl back under blankets before another engine came from a different direction and reminded them that sleep was no longer theirs to keep. A small bomb landed near the edge of the German camp, close enough to throw dirt against the tents, but not close enough to destroy the whole position. Men crawled out from under blankets, with their belts half fastened, their helmets crooked, and their hands still stiff from sleep. A flashlight beam moved across the ground, catching a shallow crater, a broken crate, and a soldier standing in the mud with one boot on and the other still eyed his bedroll. Before anyone could fully settle, another thin engine appeared from a different direction. No one trusted the night anymore. This was the kind of damage that did not always look impressive from a distance. The tents were still standing, the trucks were still there, and most of the men were still alive. A report might have described the raid as minor, with limited destruction and a few scattered losses. But the men inside the camp understood the attack differently, because it had cut into the one thing they needed before another day at the front. It had to sleep. The Night Witches often worked through repetition rather than one giant strike. Their small aircraft could not carry the heavy bomb loads of larger machines, so the pressure came from coming back again and again, often at hours when men were most desperate to rest. One bomb might wake the camp. Another might land later near the road or the supply area. A third sound in the distance could keep everyone listening even if nothing fell. It is almost cruel how little destruction was needed to ruin an entire night for men who were already living at the edge of exhaustion. A torn tent could be repaired, a damaged crate could be moved, a small crater could be filled when daylight came, but a night of sleep could not be put back together once the body had been shocked awake and forced to wait for the next engine. The soldiers began to change after repeated nights like this. Their eyes stayed red in the morning, with dark skin beneath them and a flat stare that made even simple orders feel harder to absorb. Some became quick to anger, snapping at a man who dropped a cup or stepped on a blanket. Others grew too quiet, sitting on ammunition boxes with their hands wrapped around cold mugs, staring up whenever the wind moved through the trees. Their nerves became thin. A man who had slept in broken pieces did not rise cleanly into the next day. He fumbled with straps, forgot where he had put small tools, and took longer to understand shouted instructions. When artillery sounded far away, he reacted too late or too sharply. When a vehicle engine started behind the line, his body stiffened before his mind could remind him it was friendly. The night followed him into daylight. Today, a bad night of sleep might make someone slow at work, but on the front line, it could make a man miss the second that kept him alive. That was why these raids mattered beyond the size of the bombs. Exhaustion made soldiers clumsy. It made them careless with equipment, harsh with each other, and less able to judge real danger from imagined danger. The enemy did not have to kill every man if it could make the whole unit weaker by morning. Inside the camp, sleep became a shallow thing. Men kept boots close, helmets near their hands, and coats half-buttoned because undressing felt foolish. Some lay down but did not fully rest, listening through canvas walls for the low sound of another aircraft. A few drifted off and jerked awake. Minutes later, certain they had heard an engine even when the sky was empty. The body learned fear faster than reason could correct it. The smallest sounds became suspicious. The real punishment was not only the blast, but the waiting around it. After one bomb, the men had to check for damage. After the check, they had to listen again. After listening, they had to decide whether to risk lying down. Even when they finally closed their eyes, the memory of the engine remained close, ready to drag them back awake at the first thin noise above the trees. I find it disturbing that these attacks could leave a camp mostly intact while quietly breaking the men inside it night by night. A destroyed building was easy to see. A wrecked vehicle could be counted, but a soldier who had not slept properly for days looked almost normal until he dropped something, forgot an order, stared too long at the sky, or shook while trying to light a cigarette. By dawn, the camp would look almost ordinary again. Men kicked dirt over the crater, collected scattered gear, and tried to make themselves ready for the day. But their faces gave away the truth. The raid had not needed to burn the camp down. It had only needed to remind every man that darkness no longer belonged to rest. The night witches became frightening because their small bombs returned often enough to make sleep feel unsafe. The story now moves back to the Soviet field base, where that pressure had to be created through repeated takeoffs, landings, rearming, and another climb into the cold. To keep German soldiers awake for one night, the women in the Po-2 had to wear down their own bodies until their hands were numb, their eyes burned, and the runway appeared again only as a dark strip of mud. The Po-2 came down onto the rough field with a hard bounce, its wheels cutting through mud and thin patches of snow. The pilot stayed still for a moment after landing, not because the flight was finished in any comforting way, but because her body needed one breath before moving again. A ground crew member ran toward the wing with a small lamp, while another woman bent down to check the bomb rack under the aircraft. The night was not over. It had only climbed out with stiff legs and cold hands, pulling her gloves tighter while the engine ticked and cooled behind her. Her face was red from the wind, her eyes burned from watching the dark, and the scarf around her neck had collected damp air from the flight. Someone handed her water, and she drank quickly, not because she was rested enough to want it, but because the next takeoff would not wait for comfort. Around her, the field kept working. The bombs were changed. This was the part of Night Witch's work that looked less dramatic than the stories later told about them, but it may have shown their endurance most clearly. The Po-2 could not carry a heavy load, so one mission was rarely enough to keep pressure on a target for long. To disturb German positions through the night, the crews had to fly, return, rearm, and go up again. The same darkness had to be entered more than once. It is almost unfair that their courage was measured not by one grand heroic flight, but by how many times they could climb back into the same freezing aircraft after already surviving it. A single takeoff required focus, a second required discipline. A third, after cold had reached the fingers and fatigue had settled behind the eyes, required something harder to name. It was not excitement anymore, it was duty mixed with stubbornness. The field base moved with quiet urgency. Mechanics worked close to the wings, hands dark with oil and mud, checking cables, fuel, and small parts that could fail at the worst moment. Navigators looked again at maps under weak light, marking routes that had to be remembered once the ground vanished into blackness. Pilots listened to brief instructions, adjusted equipment, and tried to keep their minds clear enough to notice one wrong detail before it became fatal. Everyone looked tired. No one could soften. Each return to the airfield brought relief, but only in a narrow sense. The crew had not been shot down. The engine had held. The runway had appeared where it should have been, yet the moment the aircraft stopped, the next part of the work began immediately, and relief was swallowed by preparation. A safe landing did not mean rest. It meant the machine could be sent back. That rhythm wore down the body. After several flights, the cold no longer felt sharp in a simple way. It became heavy, sitting in the fingers, wrists, jaw, and knees. Eyes grew dry from wind and strain, and the mind began to move through tasks by habit because clear thought took too much effort. A pilot might remember the target, the direction, the timing, and the return path, while also fighting the small mistakes that came with exhaustion. A missed landmark could matter. A slow reaction could matter more. Today, repeating a difficult task all night might sound exhausting enough, but repeating it while flying low over enemy territory made tiredness itself a danger. The body did not become brave just because the mission was important. Fingers still went numb. Shoulders still tightened. Hunger still distracted the mind. Sleep still pulled at the edges of thought. The difference was that these women had to keep working while every ordinary human weakness stayed in the cockpit with them. The ground crews shared that burden. They were not simply waiting while the pilots made history. They loaded bombs, checked damage, handled tools in the cold, and watched the aircraft disappear again into darkness. When a plane returned, they had to look for holes, loose parts, leaking fuel, or signs that one more flight might be too much for the machine. Then they had to prepare it anyway if the order remained. The night kept asking for more. Many night witches flew enormous numbers of missions over the course of the war, and that record was built from nights like this, not from one clean moment of glory. It came from repeated climbs into open cockpits, repeated passes over enemy lines, repeated landings on rough ground, and repeated decisions to continue when the body wanted to stop. The German soldiers below felt the pressure from broken sleep. The women above paid for it in cold, strain, and risk. I find it powerful that the thing which made them terrifying to the enemy also quietly punished them every hour they kept doing it. They were not outside the suffering they created, they were inside another version of it, trading warmth, rest and safety for the chance to deny those same things to German troops. Their endurance was not clean or easy to admire from a distance. It was muddy, repetitive, and physically costly. Near the end of the night, the field could seem almost unreal. Lamps made small circles on the ground. Breath showed in the cold air. A pilot stepping down from one flight might already hear the next aircraft being prepared behind her. Somewhere beyond the runway, the front waited in darkness, and beyond that were the men who would hear the engine, lose the engine, and fear the silence again. The women climbed back in. A night of repeated flights showed that the night witches did not frighten German soldiers through one sudden act, but through a rhythm that demanded cold endurance from the women as much as fear from the men below. The next part moves into the one thing every crew needed when the map was hard to read, and the ground below looked almost empty. In that darkness, a wrong river bend, A mistaken road or one false patch of light could send the Po-2 straight toward German guns. Inside the open cockpit, the map did not sit still. It shook under the navigator's hand as the Po-2 moved through the cold night air, and the paper edges lifted whenever the wind found a loose corner. Below the aircraft, the ground was not a clear picture, but a dark surface broken by a few pale marks, a river bend, a small road, a patch of forest, and the faint glow of a village trying not to be seen. The crew had to read all of it quickly. A mistake could lead to death. Night flying was not only about courage, it required memory, patience, and a kind of practical attention that left no room for daydreaming. A pilot had to feel the aircraft, judge the wind, keep the height low enough for the mission, and still avoid letting the ground rise too close. The navigator had to compare what she saw below with what the map promised, even when the map looked cleaner and kinder than the real Earth beneath them. The darkness hid too much. A river could look like a strip of black cloth under the moon. A road could vanish under trees and reappear in the wrong place. A village light could be a real landmark, a decoy, a fire, or a dangerous sign that they had drifted nearer to enemy positions than planned. In daylight, a pilot could correct more easily. At night, each correction carried its own risk. It is almost cruel that the women sent to frighten. German soldiers also had to trust a shaking map, a few shadows, and their own tired eyes to keep themselves alive. The Po-2 was simple, but the task was not simple. The crew could not merely fly forward and drop bombs wherever they wished. They had to reach the right area, approach from a useful direction, avoid obvious danger, and return before fuel, weather, or gunfire punished them. The ground below gave hints, not answers. Many night bombing missions in the Second World War depended heavily on visual observation, manual navigation, and the experience of the crew. Instruments helped, but they did not remove the need to recognize the world below in poor light. A bend in a river, a road crossing, a strip of open field, or the outline of a forest could become as important as any order given before takeoff. The pilot and navigator had to turn memory into survival. Their eyes did the work of machines. After several flights in one night, even that became harder. The cold made the face stiff. Wind dried the eyes until every blink felt rough. Fatigue made the same patch of ground seem familiar when it was not, and made a real landmark feel doubtful because the mind had already been pushed too far. A woman could know the route, repeat it, and still feel a small fear rise when the dark below refused to match the shape in her memory. There was no safe confusion. Today, missing a turn on a dark road might cost a few minutes, but missing the right turn over enemy territory could lead straight into searchlights, guns, or a field they could never leave. That was the difference between ordinary navigation and wartime night flying. A wrong river bend might pull the plane too far west. A mistaken road might bring it over a defended position. A false light might invite them lower, closer, and deeper into danger. The navigator leaned over the map, then looked down again. The pilot kept the plane steady while also listening to the engine, feeling the air, and watching for the first signs of the target area. Neither woman could afford panic, because panic wasted seconds, and seconds mattered. The German line was not a wall that they could see clearly. It was a region of risk spread across darkness. Every landmark had weight. The mission could fail before a bomb was ever released. If the crew drifted too far, they might waste fuel searching for the target. If they circled too long, the enemy might hear them and prepare. If they crossed into the wrong place, they could meet ground fire before understanding how they had arrived there. The danger was not only at the target. It was along the path. I find it unsettling that their bravery was built from small acts of accuracy, not just from flying into danger. Remembering a dark river mattered, not trusting the wrong light mattered. Knowing when the shape of the land felt wrong mattered. These were not dramatic gestures, but they were the kind of details that decided whether two women returned to the muddy runway or vanished into night. Below them, a faint line of water appeared where it should have been. The navigator checked the map again, then pointed. The pilot adjusted the course, not sharply, but enough to bring the aircraft toward the next reference point. The target was closer now, and the quiet concentration inside the cockpit tightened. Soon, the work of finding the way would become the work of surviving the approach. The guns were waiting ahead. In the dark, the Night Witches had to trust memory, eyesight, and small marks on the ground because the map alone could not save them. The next part follows the moment when correct navigation brought them not to safety, but into the brightest danger of the night. One sweep of a German searchlight could turn the little Po-2 from a hidden shadow into a slow target trapped in white light. The Po-2 was almost over the target when the first searchlight rose from the ground. It moved across the sky in a wide, pale sweep, missing the aircraft at first, then sliding back as if someone below had heard the engine and guessed the direction. A second beam cut upward from another position, crossing the first one and turning the dark air into a bright trap. For one short moment, the little plane was still hidden. Then the light found it. The change was immediate. The aircraft that had been a shadow against the night became visible, slow, small, and exposed in the white glare. The pilot lowered herself slightly in the open cockpit, not because it could truly protect her, but because the body reacts when danger suddenly becomes visible. The navigator held the map and equipment close, while the wings shone pale under the searchlight. The darkness had betrayed them. German forces had several ways to fight night attacks. They could listen for engines, sweep the sky with searchlights, fire machine guns, and use anti-aircraft weapons to force the aircraft away or shoot it down. Against a small plane like the Po-2, even light ground fire could be deadly if it found the right angle. The aircraft had no thick armour to absorb punishment. It had speed only in a limited sense and very little room for mistakes. It is almost frightening how quickly the same darkness that protected the Night Witches could disappear. The moment one German searchlight touched the wing, a second earlier, the crew had been difficult to see. Now the light marked them for every gunner below who could turn his weapon upward. The aircraft did not need to be large to become a target. It only needed to be visible. The firing began from below. Tracer rounds rose through the night, bright lines climbing toward the aircraft from several directions. Some passed wide, some came close enough to make the crew feel the air change around them. The pilot had to keep control while the instinct to turn away pressed hard against the need to finish the mission. If she moved too sharply, she could lose position. If she stayed too steady, the gunners could adjust. There was no comfortable choice. The Po-2 had always been fragile, but in the searchlight, it looked even more vulnerable. Fabric wings, light frame, open cockpit, small engine, and two women inside with almost nothing between their bodies and the bullets below. The ground crews could repair small damage if the plane returned, but they could not repair a direct hit in the wrong place. Fire, fuel, wood, cloth, and cold air made a poor promise of safety. Today, a bright light usually helps a person find the way, but for these pilots, it could mean that every weapon below had finally found them. That reversal made the moment so tense. Light did not guide them home, it exposed them. It took away the one advantage they had carefully used on the approach, and it did so in full view of the enemy waiting beneath them. The pilot had to work with small movements. Too much panic could be worse than the light itself. She watched the angle, felt the aircraft, and tried to slip out of the beam before the fire grew more accurate. The navigator still had to keep track of the target, the timing, and the release because fear did not cancel the mission. The bomb had to go somewhere. The sky narrowed. For the men on the ground, this was their chance. The strange little aircraft that had bothered them in the dark was now caught where they could see it. Searchlight crews tried to hold it. Gunners tried to climb their fire into its path. Soldiers had cursed the invisible raids could finally look up and see the small shape that had stolen their sleep. That made the moment dangerous for everyone. The aircraft moved on. I find it harsh that the Night Witches became frightening by hiding in darkness, yet had to accept that any second of light could turn them from hunters into prey. Their courage was not clean or distant. It sat inside the cockpit while bullets climbed from below, and the white glare made every movement feel too slow. They had to keep flying with the knowledge that the next beam might not miss. A round could tear fabric. A burst could damage the engine. A small mistake under pressure could pull the aircraft lower than intended or carry it across the wrong patch of guns. Even if no bullet struck, the moment left a mark on the body. The heart stayed hard in the chest. The hands gripped too tightly, and the mind had to force itself back into the simple order of tasks. Find the route, release the bomb, get out. The Po-2 slipped near the edge of the light, then into darkness again. The guns kept firing for a few seconds longer, following where it had been rather than where it was going. Below, the searchlights continued to sweep the sky, hunting for the small shape again. Above, the pilot and navigator kept moving through the cold, knowing that escape from one beam did not mean the night had forgiven them. The searchlight showed dangerous each could become, because one pale beam could turn a hidden Po-2 into a slow target for every gun below. The next part looks at why German pilots and gunners still struggled to deal with this strange little aircraft. Even when they knew it was coming, a modern fighter could be too fast, too heavy, and too high to easily catch a plane crawling low through darkness like a stubborn insect near the ground. A German fighter could cross the night sky with far more speed, power, and modern force than the little Po-2 below it. Its engine was stronger, its weapons were heavier, and its pilot belonged to an air force that had already built much of its pride around technical skill. On paper, the match looked absurd. A fast combat aircraft should not have struggled with a slow wooden biplane flying low over dark ground. But paper did not fly at night. The Po-2 was not trying to fight like a fighter. It did not climb high to challenge German aircraft in a clean contest of speed and firepower. It stayed low, moved slowly, used darkness, and appeared near targets at awkward times. A German pilot who came in too fast could overshoot the target before lining up properly, especially when the Soviet plane was close to the ground and difficult to hold in sight.
Speed. Clumsy.
It is almost embarrassing that a machine built for serious air combat could be made awkward by a small aircraft that looked too weak to deserve respect. The Po-2 did not win by being stronger. It survived by being strange. Its slowness, which looked like a weakness in daylight, could become a problem for aircraft designed to chase faster targets. At night, with poor visibility and little room near the ground, the stronger machine did not always get the clean advantage it expected. The German side had the better technology in many situations, but technology still had to meet the conditions of the fight. A fast aircraft needed time, angle, visibility, and space. A low target near trees, fields, smoke, or dark ground could be hard to track. If the attacker drove too aggressively, the ground itself became a danger. If he stayed cautious, the Po-2 might slip away into darkness. That's made the problem irritating. For the soldiers below, this was worse than simply being attacked. They wanted to believe that their own aircraft and weapons could handle the nuisance. They wanted to believe that anything old and slow would be quickly removed from the sky, but night after night, the small planes returned. The men heard them again, lost them again, and waited again for the silence before the bomb. The insult kept coming back. A German soldier did not need to understand every detail of air combat to feel the frustration. He only needed to lie awake in the mud after another broken night and know that the aircraft had escaped again. He might hear talk of fighters, guns, searchlights and patrols, yet still find himself listening to the same thin engine on another night. That gap between confidence and experience created a special kind of anger. Today it would be like owning the strongest lock on the street and still being kept awake by someone tapping on your window every night. The tapping might not destroy the house. It might not even break the glass. But after enough nights, the owner stops thinking about the strength of the lock and starts waiting for the next sound. That was what the Po-2 did to men who wanted the war to make sense. The aircraft's weakness also made it harder to predict. It could use rough fields, fly low, and return in small repeated attacks. It did not announce itself with the heavy presence of a large bomber stream. It came as a stubborn disturbance, and then another, and then another. The more it returned, the more the German soldiers had to admit that the problem was not simply technical, it was psychological. Their pride had no rest either. The women flying the Po-2 were not safe because of this. They were still exposed to gunfire, searchlights, weather, engine trouble, and the danger of flying low at night. A slow plane could frustrate a fighter, but it could also be destroyed by a lucky burst from the ground. The advantage was never clean. It was narrow, temporary, and bought with skill. If you enjoy this kind of slow war history, told through the small details people usually forget, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel before we continue deeper into the night. These stories are not only about machines and battles, but about fear, exhaustion, and the strange ways ordinary limits shaped real survival. The more closely we look, the less simple the word weak becomes. I find it unsettling that the Po-2 did not need to defeat German technology grandly, because it only had to make that technology feel less certain in the dark. That uncertainty mattered. A weapon that should have been dismissed became a recurring problem. A plane that looked outdated became a shape men searched for in the night. A nuisance became a name. The German troops began to talk about the women who flew these aircraft. They gave them a nickname that carried both mockery and fear, because soldiers often name what they cannot easily control. The sound of the gliding plane, the repeated raids, and the feeling of being hunted by something almost invisible, all blended in tired minds. The name made the fear easier to speak about. It also made it harder to forget. The Po-2 proved that stronger machines did not always control the night, especially when a slow aircraft used darkness, low flying, and repetition against tired men. That frustration now leads to the name German soldiers gave the women who kept returning above them. They called them Night Witches, a name that sounded like an insult until every man in the trench understood it meant. The engine might vanish, and the bomb might already be falling. Inside a German dugout, the name did not begin like a clean historical label. It began in tired voices around a weak lamp after another night when the engine had appeared, faded, and left men waiting for the ground to shake. A soldier might mention the sound of the aircraft gliding down, thin and strange in the darkness, almost like something brushing across the sky. Another man would remember it differently, but the feeling was the same. They needed a name for it. When danger repeats often enough, soldiers begin to turn it into language. They name a shell, a weapon, a road, a ruined village, or a certain hour of the night, because fear is harder to carry when it has no shape. The little Soviet aircraft were difficult to see, difficult to predict, and impossible to fully dismiss once they had stolen enough sleep. So the nickname grew from the trenches and dugouts, passed from one exhausted man to another's, Night Witches. The name was meant to sound dark, mocking, and strange. It carried the old insult that women who threatened men must be unnatural, as if skill, discipline, and courage were easier to accept when turned into superstition. German soldiers were not calmly admiring the women above them. They were trying to explain why something so small, slow, and poorly armed could make the night feel unsafe. It is almost telling that when these women became effective, the enemy reached for a word that made them sound less like pilots and more like a nightmare. The nickname did not erase their work. It proved that their work had entered the enemy's mind. A plane could be counted in reports, a bomb crater could be measured, and a raid could be described as minor. But a nickname showed something different. It showed memory. The sound mattered most. Stories about the Night Witches often connect the nickname to the noise made when their aircraft glided toward the target. After the engine was reduced and the wings moved through the air. To men below, half awake and half afraid, that faint passing sound could feel like a broom sweeping across the night. It was not a large sound, but it arrived at the worst possible moment. A whisper can be enough. The nickname turned a military tactic into a symbol. These were still real women flying real aircraft. But in the German imagination, they began to grow larger than the machines they used. They became the ones who came when men tried to sleep. They became the ones who made silence dangerous. They became the ones whose small bombs did not always destroy a camp, but could leave men staring at the roof of a dugout until morning. Today, people might think a nickname is just a detail, but on a battlefield, it can reveal exactly what soldiers fear enough to talk about again and again. Men do not give lasting names to things that leave no mark on them. They name what follows them into sleep, what interrupts meals, what makes them glance upward without wanting to. In that sense, the nickname was less about folklore and more about nervous exhaustion. The strange part is that the insult eventually became a kind of honor. The women did not choose the name to decorate themselves. It came from the men they were attacking, from the side that wanted them gone and wanted the raids to stop. Yet the name survived because it carried the truth of the effect. They had made an enemy who often underestimated women speaking about them with fear. The name turned back on its makers. In the dugouts, German soldiers could still joke about the old aircraft. They could still complain that the bombs were small, that the planes were outdated, that the raids were more annoying than decisive. But the jokes had to compete with the fact that no one slept easily when the sound returned. A joke becomes thinner when every man in the room knows he will still reach for his helmet when the engine fades. I find it powerful that a name meant to make them sound strange ended up preserving the evidence that they had truly disturbed the enemy. The Night Witches were not frightening because they were magical. They were frightening because they were consistent. They returned through cold, darkness, gunfire, rough landings, and doubt. The legend grew because the work was real enough to support it. But legends can hide bodies. Behind the name were young women with stiff hands, tired eyes, and faces burned by wind. They did not float through the night untouched. They sat in open cockpits, felt the cold cut through clothing, fought sleep, checked maps in bad light, and trusted small aircraft that offered little protection. The nickname made them sound unreal, but the suffering behind it was very ordinary. That is what matters. The name Night Witches began as a fearful label from German soldiers who needed words for the strange sound that kept returning above them. The next part strips away that legend and returns to the real women inside the open cockpit, where the cold hit their faces before the enemy ever did. Behind the frightening nickname were pilots gripping frozen controls while night wind cut through their coats and turned every flight into a test of the body. The wind hit her face before the aircraft had even reached the target. It came over the open cockpit in a hard stream, pushing against her goggles, pulling at the edges of her scarf, and finding every small opening in her coat. Her gloved hands stayed on the controls, but the cold still worked through the material and settled into her fingers. Below the Po-2, the ground was a black surface with no comfort in it. There was nowhere warm to hide. The Po-2 was useful for night harassment, but it did not protect the body well. Its open cockpit left the pilot and navigator exposed to wind, cold air, engine noise, and the long strain of watching the dark. A more comfortable aircraft might have softened some of that suffering. This one gave the women the sky directly, without much mercy between their skin and the night. The cold became part of the mission. At first it might feel sharp on the cheeks and around the eyes. After longer minutes, it began to dull the hands and stiffen the jaw. The face could burn and go numb at the same time, while the eyes watered behind the goggles and then dried again in the wind. Every small movement became more difficult when the body was trying to protect itself from the air. It is almost cruel that the fear they created below was paid for by their own bodies freezing above the same battlefield. German soldiers heard the engine and feared the silence that followed. But the women inside the aircraft were not floating above the war untouched. They were sitting in a small exposed machine, fighting cold, fatigue, and fear, while still having to fly with precision. The legend sounded ghost-like from the ground. The reality was physical. The pilot could not simply endure the cold in a general way. She had to keep feeling the controls, judging the movement of the aircraft, and making corrections that could not be delayed. If her hands stiffened too much, the plane did not become easier to guide. If her eyes burned from wind and darkness, the ground did not become easier to read. If her body wanted to curl inward for warmth, the mission still demanded attention outward. Nothing stopped needing accuracy. The navigator suffered beside her in a different form of the same cold. She had to hold the map, watch landmarks, handle equipment, and prepare for the bomb release while the wind shook paper and cloth around her. Her fingers had to work even when they felt thick and slow. A strap, a pencils, a map fold, or a release mechanism could become frustrating when the body had already lost some of its fine control. Today, cold usually means discomfort, but in that cockpit it could mean slower hands, blurred judgment, and one late movement over enemy ground. The difference mattered. A person standing in cold air can step inside, warm their fingers, and complain later. A pilot over the front had no such choice. The cold came with the mission and stayed until the aircraft returned, if it returned at all. The darkness added its own pressure. The women could not relax their eyes for long, because the route, the target, and the danger all had to be found in poor light. A faint river line might matter, a small fire might matter, a darker patch of forest might tell them they were on course or drifting toward danger. The night gave few answers, and the body was already tired while trying to read them. The strain collected slowly. A single flight could be endured. Several flights in one night turned endurance into a harder thing. The face grew raw from wind, the shoulders tightened from holding position, and the mind began to move through tasks with a dry, stubborn focus. There was no room for dramatic fear every minute. Fear took too much energy. The work itself filled the space. I find it unsettling that their bravery often looked like silence, not because they felt to merit nothing, but because there was no useful place to put the pain. A complaint could not warm the cockpit. A pause could not stop the wind. A moment of self-pity could not guide the aircraft home. They had to keep the discomfort contained and let their hands continue doing what the mission required. When the Po-2 turned toward the return route, the cold did not suddenly release them. It stayed in the fingers, in the cheeks, in the eyes, and in the slow ache of a body that had been held tense for too long. Landing on the rough field might bring relief, but even that relief was limited. The next flight could already be waiting, along with new bombs, new instructions, and the same open cockpit. The night kept its price. The nickname Night Witches made them sound distant from ordinary human limits, but each flight proved the opposite. They were dangerous because they endured ordinary limits again and again without letting those limits to stop the mission. The cold did not make them mythical. It made their work harder, slower, and more costly in ways that no enemy soldier below could see. The open cockpit showed that the Night Witches were not protected by legend because every flight forced wind, cold, and darkness directly against their bodies. The next part moves from discomfort to a harsher problem, the missing protection and poor equipment that made each mission feel even less forgiving. If the aircraft caught fire, broke apart, or fell behind enemy lines, there might not be enough safety gear to give them even a fair chance of survival. Before takeoff, the work looked ordinary from a distance. A pilot checked the straps, the map, the watch, and the small details around the aircraft that had to be right before the wheels left the ground. A mechanic looked under the wing where the bombs were fixed, while another woman held a lamp low enough to keep the light from spreading too far. The Po-2 waited in the dark, simple and exposed. Some things were missing. In a better war, with better supplies and safer aircraft, a pilot might have expected more protection before flying into enemy territory, more reliable gear, better clothing, stronger aircraft, safer equipment, and the comforting feeling that if something went wrong, there was at least a fair chance to survive it. But the Soviet Union was fighting under brutal pressure, and many units had to work with what was available, not what would have been ideal. The Night Witches knew this very well. They checked what they had. The Po-2 itself offered little forgiveness. It was light, useful and stubborn, but it was not a machine built to absorb punishment. Its fabric wings, open cockpit and simple frame made every mission feel close to the body. If it was hit by gunfire, caught in a searchlight, damaged in bad weather, or forced down behind enemy lines, the women inside had very little between themselves and the full consequences of the mistake. It is almost cruel that they were sent to make German soldiers feel unsafe at night, while sitting in aircraft that gave them so little safety of their own. That contradiction was not lost on them. They knew the fear they created below had a price above. The men in trenches feared the engine fading into silence. The women in the cockpit feared fire, impact, darkness, and the possibility that the ground below might not be friendly. The calm before takeoff was not really calm. It was control. A pilot could not allow herself to stare too long at what was missing, because the mind could become trapped there. She had to think about the route, the target, the return path, the weather, the engine, the bomb release, and the signals from her navigator. Fear had to be folded into routine. That was how she moved. Stories as the Night Witches often mention rough conditions, limited equipment, and the plain danger of their night missions. These details matter because they bring the legend back down to earth. The women were not protected by the nickname. They were young pilots and navigators using old machines, basic tools, and practiced discipline to do a job that left very little room for softness. Today, people often imagine danger with the safety systems around it, but for them, danger could mean a dark field, a burning aircraft, and no good way out. A modern person might think first of backup plans. These women often had to think first of not needing one. The best survival method was to avoid being hit, avoid getting lost, avoid engine failure, avoid panic, and bring the aircraft home before the night found a way to punish them. The equipment shortage also shaped the mind. A person who knows she is well protected can carry fear differently from someone who knows protection is thin. Every sound in the engine matters more. Every tremble in the wing matters more. Every flash from the ground carries a sharper meaning, because there may not be enough between the crew and death to make the next second forgiving. They had to stay precise. The pilot placed her hand on the fabric of the wing before climbing in, not as a grand gesture, but as part of the habit of checking and trusting the machine. The surface under her glove was not thick armour. It was material stretched over a frame that would soon carry her into cold air and enemy fire. Nearby, the navigator reviewed the map again, her face lit by a weak lamp, her attention already moving ahead into the dark. The aircraft looked small beside the night. I find it unsettling that their courage had to include accepting what they did not have, not just using what they did have. It is one thing to be brave with strong protection around you. It is another thing to climb into a light aircraft knowing that if mission turns bad, there may be no comfortable distance between risk and consequence. The Night Witches did not become remarkable because the danger was hidden from them. They became remarkable because they understood it and still went. The ground crew stepped back, rough and familiar. The pilot adjusted herself in the open cockpit, and the navigator settled with the map and equipment. Around them, the field remained dark, muddy and busy in a quiet way, as if every person there knew that hesitation could spread if anyone allowed it too much room. The plane began to move. A mission like this did not depend only on the machine, it depended on the trust the two women in because the limited equipment made every shared task more important. If one missed a landmark, the other might have to catch the mistake. If one froze under pressure, the other would feel the cost immediately. In a small aircraft with little protection, partnership became another form of survival. The Night Witches did not fly with every comfort or protection a pilot might have wanted, and that made each takeoff feel like a quiet agreement with danger. The next part moved inside the cramped aircraft, where the pilot and navigator had to trust each other in darkness as much as they trusted the engine. One wrong glance at the map, one late signal, or one moment of panic could kill both women before the German guns even needed to finish the job. Inside the small Po-2, there was almost no space for comfort. One woman held the controls, watching the dark ahead, while keeping the aircraft steady in the cold air. The other leaned over the map, the bomb release, and the few visible shapes below, trying to match the black ground with the route they had memorized before takeoff. Between them there was no room for confusion. Every movement mattered. The pilot could not do the mission alone. She could keep the aircraft flying, judge the wind, listen to the engine, and feel the slight changes in the machine beneath her hands. But she still needed the navigator to read the route, find the target, and manage the timing. The navigator could not do her work alone either, because every mark on the map meant nothing if the pilot could not place the aircraft where it needed to be. Their lives were tied together before the bomb ever left the wing. The darkness made that bond tighter. At night, words were not always useful. Wind could tear at speech, engine noise could swallow small sounds, and fear could make talking too dangerous. They learned to understand small signals, a gesture, a movement of the head, a hand pointing toward a dark river below, or the way one body shifted when the target was close. They had to trust these little signs because delay could cost them the mission. It is almost frightening how 2 lives could depend on something as small as a hand signal seen in bad light over enemy ground. There was no time for a long explanation in the sky. If the navigator saw that they were drifting, she had to show it quickly. If the pilot felt the aircraft losing the right line, she had to correct without letting panic enter her hands. In that cockpit, trust was not an emotional decoration. It was practical survival. The Night Witches often flew in pairs, with a pilot and a navigator sharing the burden of each mission. This made sense for the work they had to do, because night bombing required much more than reaching the enemy and dropping a bomb. They had to find the correct route, identify the target area, approach at the right moment, release the bomb, avoid the worst of the fire, and then return to a field that might be difficult to see until they were nearly on top of it. A single tired mind was not enough. They needed each other awake. The pilot might feel the aircraft shudder slightly and know that the wind had changed. The navigator might look down and realize that the road below was not the one they expected. A wrong correction could pull them away from the target, but failing to correct could carry them toward German guns. Neither woman could afford pride in that moment. The sky punished pride quickly. Today, teamwork often means sharing a task, but here it meant trusting someone else with the last seconds before a mistake became fatal. A late warning could bring them too close to searchlights. A mistaken landmark could waste fuel. A confused bomb release could miss the target and force another dangerous pass. Even silence had to be understood correctly, because sometimes the quiet between them meant calm focus, and sometimes it meant one of them was fighting fear too hard to speak. That trust was built over repeated flights. It did not appear in one heroic moment. It came from surviving bad approaches, rough landings, missed landmarks, frozen hands, and nights when the return route seemed longer than it should have been. Each mission taught them what the other person did under pressure. Each landing proved that the other woman had not broken when the sky became difficult. This made their bond very plain. There was no need to make it sentimental. The pilot did not need a speech from the navigator. The navigator did not need a promise from the pilot. What mattered was that each woman kept doing her part. When the aircraft was exposed, when the searchlights moved below, when the cold made the fingers slow, and when the target to be found out through darkness, their trust lived in repeated action. I find it moving that their closeness was not built from soft moments, but from knowing the other woman would stay useful when fear pressed into the cockpit. That kind of trust is harder than friendship alone. It is the trust of shared danger, where the person beside you becomes part of the equipment you depend on. The engine mattered. The map mattered. The woman beside you mattered just as much. If one panicked, both suffered. If one made a mistake, both might pay for it. If one was wounded, the other would have only seconds to understand what had changed and decide whether the aircraft could still return. The Po-2 was already fragile, and the night already gave them little room. A broken partnership would make everything worse. The target came closer. The navigator lowered her head over the map again, then looked down into the darkness and pointed. The pilot shifted the aircraft slightly, keeping the movement small and steady. Below them, the German line wetted without showing itself clearly, and above them there was only cold air, thin moonlight, and the sound of the engine carrying both women toward the next risk. Neither of them could afford to be alone inside her own fear. They flew as one machine. The pilot and navigator survived by turning trust into a working habit, because in the dark, one woman's mistake could kill them both. The next part leaves that small cockpit and returns to the field at dawn, where the hardest thing was not always taking off, but waiting for a plane that should have come back already. Sometimes the runway stayed empty, the engine never returned, and everyone on the ground had to keep working around the shape of an absence. Near dawn, the field became quieter in a way no one liked. One Po-2 had already landed, its wheels throwing mud along the rough strip, and the pilot had climbed down with her face pale from cold and strain. Another aircraft was expected behind it, but the sky remained empty, and the people on the ground began looking toward the horizon more often than they looked at their tools. The empty air started to feel heavy. Everyone knew what it might mean. A night mission could fail in many ordinary ways. A plane could lose its route, run low on fuel, strike the ground in darkness, catch fire after being hit, or disappear behind the wrong line of trees. It could be damaged by gunfire and still stay in the air for a few minutes, before going down somewhere no one could see. In daylight, loss sometimes had a shape. At night, it often arrived as silence. The runway waited. The women on the ground did not stop working. Mechanics checked the aircraft that had returned, touching fabric, cables, wheels and bomb racks, with hands made stiff by cold. Someone carried tools across the mud. Someone else stood near a set of bombs that had not yet been fitted under the wing, looking up for a sound that should have come by now. The work continued because the war did not pause to let grief become complete. It is almost cruel that a missing aircraft could leave a hole in the air, while everyone around it still had to tighten straps, check fuel, and prepare another machine for takeoff. That was how loss entered the field, not with a long ceremony, not with a clean moment where everyone could stop and understand it, but between tasks that still had to be done. The absent sat beside the lamps, the tools, the maps, and the cold metal waiting for the next crew. The hardest part was not knowing. A crash might have happened beyond the trees. The aircraft might have gone down behind German lines. The pilot and navigator might be dead, wounded, captured, or still trying to find their way back through darkness. Every possibility was bad in its own way, and each one created a different kind of fear inside the people waiting. No answer came. The Night Witches suffered real losses during the war, and the numbers behind their missions were not built without death. Their reputation came from endurance, but endurance did not make them untouchable. The same aircraft that could slip through darkness could also burn, break, or vanish. A crew could complete many missions and still meet the one night that did not let them return. Today, people often imagine courage as the moment someone goes forward, but sometimes courage is standing on a cold field and continuing your work while the place beside you stays empty. The women at the base had to learn that kind of courage too. They had to carry grief in pieces because the schedule, the targets, and the enemy did not wait for anyone's heart to catch up. Mourning became something pushed into the corners of duty. A returned pilot might climb down and ask with her eyes before she asked with words. The answer could be seen in the faces around her. A mechanic might shake her head slightly. A navigator might stare toward the dark strip of sky where the missing engine should have appeared. No one needed to make the silence larger than it already was. The field is understood. The pain was controlled, but control did not mean it was small. A woman could bend over a bomb rack with tears held back so tightly that her face looked hard rather than broken. Another could wipe mud from a wheel and keep her hands moving because stopping would make the loss too real. A pilot could sit on a crate for a few seconds longer than usual, then stand because someone had called her aircraft next. I find it heartbreaking that their grief had to become practical, measured not by how much they felt, but by how quickly they could return to the work that had just taken someone from them. There was no softness in that arrangement. The same runway that received survivors also marked the absence of those who never touched down. Every takeoff after a loss carried the memory of the empty place behind it. By sunrise, the field looked almost normal from far away. Aircraft were checked, crews moved through mud, maps were folded, and lamps were put out as the grey light grew stronger. But close up, the difference could be felt in the way people avoided looking at one another too long. A missing crew changed the weight of every ordinary task. The war kept moving. That was one of the hardest truths of the Night Witches' story. Their legend often remembers the fear they created among German soldiers, but the women themselves lived with fear, loss, and unfinished grief. They did not become famous because every plane came back. They became remembered because enough of them kept flying even after some did not. Some Po-2 aircraft never returned, and the empty runway showed that the Night Witches paid for their reputation with real lives, not just cold and tiredness. The next part turns back to what those sacrifices were meant to create on the German side. A pressure that went beyond small craters and broken tents. After enough nights, the men below were not only afraid of dying, they were afraid of staying alive without sleep, with red eyes, shaking hands, and a mind too worn down to trust the morning. By morning, the German camp did not always look destroyed. The tents were still there, the guns still pointed outward, and the men still had their rifles, packs, boots, and orders for the day. But the soldiers sitting beside their foxholes looked as if something had been taken from them during the night. Their eyes were red, their hands were dirty, and the coffee in their cups had already gone cold before breakfast was finished. The day began badly. A small crater beside a torn tent could seem like minor damage. A damaged crate, a frightened horse, or a broken section of fencing did not look like the result of a major attack. On a map or report, the raid might not appear important enough to explain the mood of the men around it, but the real damage was not only in the ground, it was in the body. Sleep had been cut apart. A soldier who had been woken again and again did not return to himself cleanly when the sun came up. He moved more slowly when called, stared too long before answering, and became irritated by things he would normally ignore. A dropped spoon, a boot in the wrong place, or a man coughing too loudly could suddenly feel unbearable. His nerves were already too close to the surface. It is almost cruel that a bomb could miss the man's body and still leave him weaker for the next fight. That was the point of the night harassment. It did not always have to kill large numbers of soldiers. It only had to disturb rest, force movement, waste attention, and make the enemy spend the night preparing for danger instead of recovering from the day before. A tired unit was easier to wear down. The Soviet purpose was practical. Night bombing and harassment attacks were meant to unsettle, interrupt, and exhaust the enemy. Every alarm required men to wake, move, check damage, listen for another aircraft, and sometimes fire into the dark. Every response costs energy. Every hour lost made the next morning harder. War punished tired men without needing to announce it. The body kept the score. A German soldier might sit on an ammunition box and rub his face with blackened fingers, trying to push away the weight behind his eyes. Another might tie his bootlaces twice, because the first knot came loose from clumsy hands. A sentry might blink too long while standing watch, then jerking away in shame when someone passed near him. These were not dramatic wounds, but they mattered. Today, losing sleep might make someone careless or short-tempered, but on a battlefield, it could turn one slow reaction into a grave one. A man who hesitated under fire might not get another chance. A man who missed a sound in the distance might fail to warn the others. A man who mistook wind for an aircraft might waste attention, while a man who ignored a real engine might pay for it. Exhaustion made every judgment less trustworthy. The attacks also forced the Germans to divide attention. Searchlights had to be used, guns had to be manned, men had to listen when they should have slept. Ammunition could be wasted against shapes that vanished into darkness. Even when the Pote did not hit anything valuable, it made the defenders behave as if danger might arrive again at any moment. That pressure accumulated. After enough nights, fear stopped being tied only to explosions. The men began to dread the hour when the sky became dark. They lay down with boots close, helmets near their hands, and coats not fully removed. Some kept their eyes open longer than they meant to, listening for the thin engine they hated. Others slept lightly and woke with their hearts racing because a truck stuttered somewhere behind the line. The mind learned badly. I find it unsettling that the Night Witches could make men fear survival itself, because surviving one night only meant facing another night without real rest. Death was not the only threat. So was being kept awake, kept tense, kept angry, and kept just alert enough to never recover. A man could remain alive and still feel his strength being taken from him in small pieces. By daylight, officers still expected discipline. Weapons had to be cleaned, orders had to be followed, damaged areas had to be repaired, and the front still demanded movement. The war did not care that the men had slept in fragments. It did not care that a soldier's hands shook when he lifted his cup. It did not care that he had begun hearing engines in ordinary wind. The night had followed him. This is why the small bombs mattered more than their size suggested. The Night Witches were not only making holes in the ground, they were making holes in rest, in routine, and in the thin mental wall that allowed exhausted soldiers to continue functioning. The craters could be filled. The lost sleep could not. The Night Witches left more than small craters behind them, because their real weapon was the long fatigue that settled into German bodies by morning. The next part looks at what happens when exhausted men try to explain a danger they can barely see and cannot stop. In dugouts and trenches, rumours began to grow until the women above them seemed larger than their aircraft, almost like something the night itself had sent back again. In the dugout, the story changed each time it was told. One German soldier said the aircraft came without sound. Another said the engine always died just before the bomb fell. And another insisted the sky itself seemed to go still when they were near. The lamp on the table was weak. The map on the wall hung unevenly, and dust fell from the ceiling whenever a distant blast shook the ground. No one in the room felt rested enough to argue clearly. Rumour had room to grow. War was a perfect place for rumors because men were often tired, frightened, and missing the full truth. A soldier might hear one engine, survive one blast, and then repeat the story later, with the worst part sharpened in his memory. Another man might add what he had heard from a different trench. By the end of a few nights, the small Po-2 could feel larger than the machine itself. The mind helped the fear. The Night Witches were real pilots using real tactics, not ghosts in the sky. They flew low, approached carefully, and used the weakness of their aircraft in a practical way. But the German soldiers below did not experience that as a calm technical fact. They experienced it after broken sleep, cold food, sudden alarms, and hours of waiting for a sound that might vanish before impact. It is almost natural that exhausted men turned a small aircraft into something darker, because fear rarely stays the same size as the thing that caused it. A bomb crater could be measured, a damaged tent could be repaired, a broken crate could be counted, but a story carried by tired men could spread through a dugout, a camp, or a trench line until the aircraft above seemed to belong to the night itself. The nickname had already helped that process. Night Witches sounded like something more than a unit of women flying old biplanes. It sounded like a warning. It gave soldiers a way to talk about the attacks, without admitting that simple, slow aircraft had made them nervous. The word carried mockery, but it also carried defeat inside it. They had been remembered rumors did not need every detail to be true. They only needed to connect with something the soldiers had already felt. The engine had faded before. The bomb had landed after a silence. The planes had returned when men thought the night might finally settle. Once those things had happened enough times, even a false story could feel believable because it rested on real exhaustion. Today, a rumor might spread through a phone screen, but in those dugouts it spread through red eyes, shaking hands, and men whispering around a lamp after another ruined night. That made it harder to stop. No official correction could erase what a soldier thought he had heard above him. No officer could order a tired body to stop reacting to the memory of a sound. Fear had already learned its route. Each new raid confirmed the old stories. If a soldier heard the engine and then the silence, he remembered what others had said. If a bomb fell near the camp, he told the next man that the story had been right. If nothing fell, he still waited longer than he wanted to, because the rumor had taught him that danger might be late, hidden or circling back. The aircraft did not arrive alone anymore. It arrived with everything said about it. That is how psychological pressure grows. It does not depend only on the weapon. It depends on the way men talk after the weapon has passed. The Night Witches had a small aircraft, a limited bomb load, and rough conditions, but German imagination added another layer. Every repeated attack gave the rumor more weight, and every rumor made the next attack feel worse. If you enjoy this kind of quiet war history, where the real fear is found in small details rather than loud spectacle, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these forgotten human stories alive, especially the ones hidden behind names, rumors, and battlefield legends. Now, let us return to the cold ground and the darker truth behind the myth. I find it unsettling that the women did not have to be supernatural for the enemy to start speaking of them as if they were. They were young pilots, navigators, and ground crew members doing difficult work with old machines. But the men under attack did not see their cold hands, tired faces, muddy boots, or rough field bases. They saw only the result. The result felt larger than life. That size was youthful. A feared enemy can affect men before the next attack even begins. German soldiers could lie in place, hear nothing at all, and still remember what the rumor had prepared them to fear. Their bodies might tense before the engine came. Their sleep might have been broken before the bomb fell. Their minds had started working against them. The real aircraft remained small. This is why the legend of the Night Witches cannot be separated from the conditions that created it. The tactics were real, the sound was real, the night raids were real, and the exhaustion of the German soldiers was real. But memory, rumour and wartime fear made everything heavier. A small plane became a story. A story became a warning. A warning became part of the night. The women above did not need to know every rumour to feel the danger of their work. While German soldiers turned them into something almost ghostly, the pilots still had to climb into cold cockpits, handle poor equipment, and face the doubts of people on their own side. The myth grew below them, but the real women lived inside ordinary hardship. They were not shadows, they were human. Rumour made the Night Witches seem larger than their small aircraft, because exhausted German soldiers added fear, memory, and imagination to every sound in the sky. The next part turns away from the German dugouts and back to the Soviet side, where the women behind the legend still had to face judgment from men who doubted they belonged in combat at all. Before they made the enemy fear them, they had to walk across their own airfield under the eyes of men waiting for them to fail. A young Soviet pilot walked across the field with mud on her boots and her coat hanging too large on her shoulders. Behind her, an old Lafayette near the runway with its fabric wings, open cockpit, and small frame making the whole unit look easier to dismiss than it truly was. A few male soldiers watched her pass without needing to say much, because sometimes judgment is carried more clearly in a look than in a sentence. She kept walking anyway. She had work to do. The Soviet Union needed people for a war that had become a fight for survival. Women were pulled into factories, hospitals, communications, anti-aircraft units, partisan work and military aviation, because the country could not afford to leave willing hands unused. But using women did not mean every man suddenly respected them. Old ideas did not vanish just because the front was burning. Suspicion followed them. A woman in a flight jacket could still be treated as if she were an experiment. Some men wondered whether they could handle combat. Others looked at the old aircraft and decided the unit was less serious before it had even taken off. The women had to carry that doubt along with maps, fuel, bombs, cold, and the knowledge that German fire would not become gentler simply because the pilots were female. It is almost ridiculous that women were considered doubtful for combat, then handed freezing cockpits, night missions, weak aircraft, and the job of disturbing emitters behind the front. The contradiction was plain. If they failed, the failure could be blamed on their sex. If they succeeded, some people would call it luck, novelty, or the result of easier work. They had to prove themselves in a space where proof was always demanded twice. They did not answer mainly with speeches. They answered by flying. Each takeoff became part of the argument. Each return in the dark made the judgment hard to maintain. Each bomb dropped near German positions did more than disturb the enemy. It pushed back to them to be frightened, weak, or unserious. Their discipline became their reply. The pressure was not only by emotional. Resources, assignments, respect and the way mistakes were remembered. A male pilot might make an error and be treated as one tired man in a hard war. A female pilot might make the same error and feel the weight of every man waiting to say he had known this would happen. That kind of scrutiny is exhausting even before the aircraft leaves the ground. Today people might call it proving yourself in a difficult workplace. But here, the workplace was a dark sky where one mistake could end in fire, capture, or an empty runway at dawn. The women had to be competent under conditions that punished ordinary human limits. They had to be calm when watched, steady when underestimated, and useful when the mission became dangerous. Their confidence could not be louder. It had to survive contact with reality. The male-controlled world around them did not change all at once. Respect came slowly, and sometimes it came only after the evidence became impossible to ignore. A woman who returned from one mission might still be doubted. A woman who returned from many missions became harder to dismiss. A unit that kept German soldiers awake night after night became something more than a curiosity. It became a problem. That was where resentment began to turn into recognition. The same old PO2 that made the unit look weak in daylight helped create results in darkness. The same young faces that some men had doubted became faces seen again and again near the aircraft, near the maps, near the bomb racks, ready for another flight. Their presence stopped looking temporary. It became part of the war's machinery. I find it powerful that their pride did not need to be loud, because every completed mission said what argument could not. They had been told in many ways that they were unlikely to belong, so they made belonging practical. They learned the aircraft, the routes, the night, the work and the risks. They became useful in a way that left little space for easy ridicule. Still, being respected did not make the job safe. The German guns were still waiting. The cold still cut through the cockpit. The ground still disappeared into darkness. The women were not fighting prejudice, but instead war. They were fighting prejudice on the way to war, then fighting the war itself before returning to face another night. That was the double front. On the airfield, a pilot could feel eyes on her as she checked the aircraft. She might hear nothing openly cruel, yet understand exactly what was being measured. Her hands moved over the familiar parts of the machine. Her posture stayed straight. Her face remained calm enough for the people watching and focused enough for the mission ahead. Anger had to be controlled. The engine started behind her. Over time, the numbers began to matter, not as empty decoration, but as accumulated proof. Mission after mission showed that the women were not there because of a slogan, a mistake, or a moment of desperation. They were there because they could do the work. The men who doubted them might not all apologize, but the record began speaking in a language even the harshest doubter could understand. The sky kept count. Before the Night Witches became a fear in German trenches, they had to become undeniable on their own side, where every mission pushed back against the men who expected them to fail. The next part follows that proof, as it gathered not in one dramatic night, but in long records, repeated sorties, and numbers heavy enough to turn doubt into silence. Their legend was built line by line in mission books, where every entry meant another cold flight survived and another night stolen from the enemy. On the wooden table, the mission book did not look dramatic. It held lines of writing, times, targets, names, aircraft numbers, and notes that reduced a night of danger into something neat enough to record. One line might mean a takeoff through mud, a low flight over enemy ground, a bomb released into darkness, and a return to a field lit by weak lamps. Another line might mean the same journey without a return. The book stayed open. This was how the Night Witches built their reputation, not through one perfect night that explained everything, and not through a single attack that changed the whole course of the war by itself. Their weight came from repetition, from the same basic danger accepted again and again until the numbers became heavy. War often remembers one spectacular moment, but much of war is made from repeated work that slowly wears down bodies, machines, and enemies. The pages made that clear. A mission written in a book can look small, The handwriting does not show the cold in the cockpit, the wind striking the face, the hand tightening on the control, or the seconds when a searchlight or Mossad finds the wing. It does not show the German soldiers pulled awake below, the crater beside a tent, or the mechanic waiting at the field to see whether the wheels touch ground again. The line is short because the paper has no room for fear. The night had room for plenty. It is almost strange that a whole legend could be built from entries so plain. They looked like office work when each line meant 2 women had gone back into danger. That is the hidden weight of records. They can make suffering look tidy, a target, a time, a result, a return. Yet behind those few marks were cold hands, tired eyes, rough landings, missing crews, and the pressure of knowing the next night might add another line, or leave a blank place where a name should have been. The regiment became known for flying a very large number of missions during the war. Many of its members were later honoured, and some received the highest recognition their country could give. But honours came later. At the moment, the work was not polished by memory. It was muddy, cold, repetitive, and often invisible to anyone beyond the field, the target, and the people who survived the night. The aircraft kept moving. A crew might fly more than once in a single night. The Po-2 carried only a limited load, so the effect had to be created by repeated sorties, not by one massive strike. The women took off, found the target, dropped what they carried, returned, rearmed, and went again if the schedule demanded it. Each flight added a little more pressure to the German side and a little more exhaustion to their own bodies. That was the pattern. Today, people often celebrate one big achievement, but their achievement was closer to doing a dangerous job so many times that danger itself became part of the routine. That does not make it less brave. It makes it harder. A person can be carried by emotion through one frightening moment, but returning to the same risk after fatigue, loss, cold, and doubt requires a different kind of strength. It is quieter, less colourful, and much more punishing. The mission book not only recorded success, it also carried the shadow of cost. A line could show a completed task, but everyone in the field knew what the same kind of task had taken from others. Friends had failed to return. The aircraft had been damaged. Bodies had been worn down by wind, lack of sleep, and the constant demand for alertness. Even a successful entry was not clean. It had a price. By looking at the repeated entries, you can see how the Night Witches turned small aircraft into a serious force. One Po-2 was limited. One bomb load was limited. One night raid might be called a nuisance by men who wanted to sound brave, but hundreds and thousands of flights changed the meaning of that nuisance. The enemy learned that the small aircraft might return, and the women learned that endurance could become a weapon. The numbers became memory. A pencil lay beside the book. A pair of gloves sat near the edge of the table, stiff from cold and damp from use. A folded map showed creases from many hands, and beyond the doorway another aircraft was being prepared in the dark. The scene was not grand, but it carried the real shape of their work. History was being made in routine, in tired handwriting, in another fuel check, another route, another climb into the cockpit. I find it powerful that their fame did not come from looking invincible, but from proving again and again that they would return to the sky, even when the work had already hurt them. That kind of record cannot be separated from fatigue. The longer the list grew, the more it showed both achievement and damage. Every added mission meant experience, reputation, and pressure on the enemy. It also sent another night taken from the women themselves. The German soldiers below experienced the result, not the book. They heard the engine, lost the sound, waited for the blast, and dragged themselves into another morning with less sleep than the day before. They did not see the pilot's landing, drinking cold water, checking maps, and preparing again. They only felt the pattern from below, where repetition slowly became dread. That was enough to make the name last. The women in the field knew the numbers mattered, but they also knew numbers could not explain everything. They could not explain the smell of fuel in cold air, the tremble in a hand after several flights, the silence when a plane did not return, or the way a pilot looked older near dawn than she had at sunset. The mission book counted the flights. It could not fully count what the flights did to the people making them. Still, the pages are filled. That is why their achievement should not be imagined as one shining scene. It was built through ordinary motions repeated under extraordinary risk. A pen wrote another entry, a mechanic tightened another fitting, a navigator folded another map, a pilot stepped again toward a machine that had already taken too much from her body and might yet take the rest. The war rewarded endurance harshly. The Night Witches became legendary not because of one perfect night, but because their mission books were filled with repeated flights that turned exhaustion into a weapon. The next part follows the cost hidden behind those numbers, when the women who stole sleep from German soldiers had to give up their own sleep first. After enough nights, their eyes burned, their hands trembled, and even a familiar runway could look strange through a mind starved of rest. Her eyes were red before the next flight was even called. She sat on a wooden crate near the aircraft, holding a cup of water with both hands, while the collar of her coat had gone stiff from a night damp and frozen breath. Behind her, the Po-2 was being prepared again, with small bombs fixed under the wings and a mechanic checking the same parts that had already been checked hours before. The schedule still lay on the table. Sleep was somewhere else. The strange truth was that the Night Witches made German soldiers lose sleep by first losing their own. Their raids worked because they came at night, returned often, and struck when the enemy most wanted rest. But that meant the women had to live inside the same broken rhythm. Their bodies were asked to stay sharp when the natural body wanted darkness, warmth, and stillness. War took those ordinary needs and treated them like weakness. The mission did not care. After several nights of flying, tiredness became more than a feeling. It sat behind the eyes, slowed the hands, and made small tasks feel heavier than they should have been. A glove could take longer to pull on. A strap could be checked twice, because the first check was not certain. A familiar map line could seem strange for a second, and that second could be dangerous if it happened in the air. It is almost cruel that they became famous for stealing sleep from the enemy, while their own bodies were being emptied of rest. The German soldier below might sit at dawn with red eyes and shaking hands, but the women above had paid in advance. They had flown through cold air, watched dark ground, returned to mud, taken a few mouthfuls of water, and prepared to climb back into the same aircraft. Their exhaustion was not separate from the weapon. It was part of how the weapon worked. Night missions demanded alertness from everyone involved. Pilots had to feel the aircraft and react to small changes. Navigators had to read maps, remember landmarks, handle timing, and find targets in weak light. Ground crews had to work with fuel, bombs, tools, and damaged parts when their fingers were cold and their minds were also worn thin. A tired mistake on the ground could follow the aircraft into the sky. The whole field carried fatigue. A pilot might stand up from the crate and feel her knees resist for a moment before she forced them steady. She might blink hard to clear her eyes, then look toward the dark runway and act as if the world had not narrowed to cold, lamps, mud, and the next flight. Her face could be calm, but calm was not the same as freshness. It was simply the shape discipline took when the body had no spare strength left. Today, people talk about exhaustion as something to recover from later, but in that field, later might come only after another flight over German guns. There was no clean pause where a person could repair herself before continuing. The war gave them fragments instead. A few minutes beside a crate, a drink of water, a bite of food if there was time, a brief leaning of the head before someone called the next crew. Then the work returned. The danger of fatigue was not dramatic at first. It did not always arrive as a collapse. More often it came as a missed detail, a slower reaction, or a small confusion that passed through the mind and left doubt behind it. A pilot might take a moment too long to respond to a gust. A navigator might mistake one dark line of trees for another. A mechanic might stare at a fitting and have to remind herself what she had already checked. Small errors could become final. The women knew this, which made their exhaustion harder to bear. They were not tired in a safe room. They were tired in a system where the next flight might demand perfect attention from an imperfect body. The more they flew, the more familiar the routine became, but familiarity at its own risk. A task done many times can feel automatic, and automatic work can become dangerous when the mind is starved of sleep. I find it unsettling that their strength was not the absence of weakness, but the ability to keep weakness from deciding for them. They still felt cold. They still felt hunger. Their eyes still burned, and their hands could still tremble when they removed their gloves. What made them remarkable was not that the body stopped suffering. It was that the mission continued while the suffering stayed inside them. A woman could look across the field and see another crew preparing with the same tired movements. One tightened a scarf. One leaned over a map. One rubbed her wrist where the glove had pressed too long. None of these gestures looked like legend, yet they carried the real weight of the unit. The Night Witches were not kept alive by myth. They were kept going by repeated control of ordinary human failure. The aircraft waited again. Behind the pilot, the mechanic stepped away from the wing and gave a small signal that the plane was ready. The cup in the pilot's hand was empty now. She stood, adjusted her coat, and walked toward the open cockpit with a face that did not show how badly she wanted to sleep. The enemy would hear the engine later and think only of the threat above him. He would not see this small moment before takeoff, when the threat was a tired woman forcing her body to obey. The night still needed her awake. The Night Witches made German soldiers fear another sleepless night, but they created that fear by spending their own nights in cold cockpits, muddy fields, and a tiredness that made every small mistake dangerous. The next part moves from exhaustion to a darker thought that could follow them into the air. The knowledge that if their aircraft went down beyond the front, survival might become worse than death. A burning Po-2 behind German lines could leave 2 women alive, injured, surrounded, and facing an enemy that might not treat captured Soviet female fighters with mercy. The thought could arrive in the middle of a mission, sharp and unwelcome. The Po-2 moved through the dark, while tracer rounds climbed from below, and for a second, the pilot saw the glowing lines pass ahead of the wing. Her hand tightened on the control, not enough to lose the aircraft, but enough to show that the body understood what the mind was trying to keep quiet. If the plane caught fire here, the ground below was not home. It was enemy ground. A pilot could accept the risk of being shot at. That was part of flying near the front, and by this stage, the women knew the sound of gunfire, the sweep of searchlights and the cold pressure of approaching a target. But being hit in the air was only one danger. Surviving the fall could open another, slower danger, one that waited in the dark fields, roads, and villages behind German lines. Capture was not a simple word. A downed pilot behind enemy lines could face interrogation, prison, violence, forced movement, exposure, or death. For Soviet fighters in the war against Nazi Germany, the danger was especially severe because the Eastern Front was fought with a level of brutality that made surrender and capture terrifying in their own right. For women in combat, some fears did not need to be spoken aloud in the cockpit. The silence around those fears made them heavier. It is almost unbearable that survival itself could become a danger, because living through the crash might only mean falling into the hands of the enemy. The Wyvern flew to frighten German soldiers, but each mission carried this private calculation. A direct hit might kill quickly. A damaged engine might force them down in a field they could not identify. A rough landing might leave one woman injured, and the other trying to decide whether to run, hide, burn papers, or wait for whatever came through the dark. There was no time to think gently. The pilot still had to keep the aircraft moving. The navigator still had to watch the route, the target, and the return path. Fear could not be allowed to spread through the cockpit, because panic would make the aircraft easier to lose. If they thought too much about capture, they might miss the next landmark. If they ignored it completely, they would be lying to themselves about the true cost of the mission. The middle ground was control. A burst of fire from below could turn that control into a test. The engine stutter, the wing might shiver, or a hole might appear where there had been fabric a second before. In a stronger aircraft, damage might feel survivable for longer. In the Po-2, every sound mattered. The women knew the machine too well to pretend that it could absorb endless punishment. Today, people often imagine a crash as the final disaster, but for these pilots, the crash might only be the beginning of a worse night. They could come down alive with broken limbs, burned hands, or no clear idea where the front line lay. They could hear German voices before they could move. They could find themselves in a field where the only choice was between hiding in pain and being found. The mind could picture these things even while the hands stayed steady on the controls. That was the frightening part. The pilot might glance down and see only black land beneath her. No flag marked friendly ground. No line on the earth showed where survival ended and capture began. The front existed on maps and in briefings, but from the cockpit at night, it could feel like a dark region of guesswork. One wrong turn, one damaged engine, or one forced descent could place them in a world where the mission had changed completely. They still had to fly. The navigator beside her would know the same thing. She might keep her head over the map, her fingers stiff from cold, while a part of her mind measured distance from the target, distance from danger. Trust between the two women became even more important under this pressure. If one began to lose control, the other had to remain useful. Fear could be shared, but panic could not. I find it chilling that they had to hide some of their most human fears because the aircraft had no room for them. The cockpit allowed space for the map, the controls, the bomb release, and the cold wind pushing through clothing. It did not allow space for imagining prison, interrogation, or the sound of enemy boots approaching through a field. Those thoughts had to be folded down and held under the work. The return route mattered like a lifeline. Once the bomb was released, the danger did not end, because the aircraft still had to leave enemy ground and pass the field again. A pilot who survived searchlights still had to survive the way home. A navigator who found the target still had to find the path back. Every minute over the wrong side of the line carried the same quiet question. What if the engine failed now? The Po-2 moved on through the dark, still flying, still light enough to feel fragile under every gust. The tracers faded behind it, and the pilot did not look back longer than she had to. There would be time later, perhaps on the ground, to feel the fear more fully. In the air, fear had to become attention. The field ahead was everything. For the Night Witches, being shot down did not only mean dying in the aircraft, because landing alive behind German lines could open a darker danger of capture, violence, and helpless waiting. The next part follows the short relief of returning to the Soviet field, where survival did not feel like victory for long. When the wheels touched mud again, the women had not escaped the war. They had only won enough time to breathe before the next night called them back. The wheels touched the dirt runway with a hard shake that ran through the whole Po-2. Mud jumped against the lower frame, the wings trembled, and the aircraft rolled forward under weak lamps held low by the ground crew. The pilot stayed in the cockpit for one extra moment, still gripping the controls even after the machine had slowed enough to be safe. Her body had returned before her mind fully believed it. The field received her quietly. A technician ran toward the aircraft with a lamp in one hand and tools in the other. Another woman moved toward the wing, already looking for damage in the fabric. The wires, the bomb rack, and the parts that might decide whether the plane could fly again. The navigator lowered her map, her fingers stiff from cold, and sat still for a few seconds before beginning to climb out. No one shouted with joy. Relief was too tired for that. The return from a mission did not feel like the end of a story. It was more like a narrow space between dangers. The aircraft had made it back. The crew had not fallen behind German lines, and the engine had carried them through one more stretch of darkness. But the field did not become peaceful because of that. It became busy again, because surviving one flight only created the next set of tasks. It is almost painful how little celebration there was for staying alive, because the aircraft had stopped before the work began again. The pilot might want to sit, close her eyes, or simply feel the ground under her boots. The navigator might want to warm her hands and stop looking at maps. The ground crew might want to stand still and be grateful that this plane had returned whole enough to touch down. Instead, everyone moved. The machine had to be checked. After each mission, the Po-2 needed attention. Small tears in the fabric could matter. A loose fitting could grow dangerous. Mud, cold, vibration and gunfire could leave marks that were easy to miss under poor light. Fuel had to be measured, damage had to be judged, and if more raids were planned, bombs had to be prepared again. A safe landing was only useful if it could become another takeoff. That was the rhythm of the unit. The ground crew carried much of this rhythm on their backs. Many of the workers who kept the aircraft ready were women too, and their part of the story was no less important because they stayed on the field. They handled tools in the cold, worked around fuel and bombs, waited for returning aircraft, and learned to read small signs of damage quickly. Their hands helped turn each landing into another chance. Today, people might imagine survival as a moment where everything stops and everyone breathes, but on that field, survival only meant that the next task could begin. A pilot could step down with her legs stiff and her face numb, only to hear that another aircraft needed checking, or another route was being discussed. A mechanic could touch the wing of a returned plane with relief, then bend down to inspect the same aircraft for the next flight. The war allowed only small pauses. The women learned to celebrate in tiny ways. A look from one crew member to another, a hand placed briefly on the fabric wing to feel that it was still there, a quiet exhale after the engine finally stopped. A cup of water passed without comment. These small gestures mattered because there was no room for grand emotion while the night still had hours left. The relief faded quickly. A returned crew might hear another engine approaching and turn toward the runway, hoping it belonged to a plane that had not yet come in. The memory of missing aircraft never stayed far from the field. Every landing carried the comfort of presence, but also reminded everyone how easily presence could have become absence. A woman climbing down from her plane knew she had been lucky, skilled, or both, but she also knew the difference might not hold forever. The next night waited. I find it moving that their strongest moments of relief were so small, because even being alive had to be handled quietly and quickly. They could not afford to fall apart each time they survived. They could not afford to treat every return like the end of danger. The mud under their boots, the cold around their hands, and the lamp moving along the wing all reminded them that the work was not finished. They had only crossed one dark stretch. The pilot finally removed her goggles. The skin around her eyes looked marked by pressure and wind, and her expression held that strange emptiness that comes after fear has been controlled for too long. She listened while someone spoke about the aircraft, the next preparation, or the condition of the field. Part of her remained back in the dark, where the searchlights had moved and the ground below had not been friendly. Her body was home, her mind was slower to arrive. This was the quiet truth behind the Night Witch's endurance. Their missions did not end with flags, speeches, or clean relief. They ended with mud, inspection, tired hands, and the knowledge that the same aircraft might be needed again. Each return was precious, but it did not free them from the night. It only proved that the night had not taken them yet. The field kept breathing around them. A mechanic stepped back from the wing and gave a short report. The navigator folded the map and held it close against the damp air. The pilot touched the side of the cockpit before stepping fully away, as if confirming that the machine which had carried her back was still solid under her hand. For a few seconds, that was enough. Then, preparation resumed. Returning to the field meant the Night Witches survived one mission, but it did not mean the war had released them from the dark. The next part looks at why their true terror did not come from overwhelming power, but from a stubborn return that made German soldiers feel the night could never be trusted again. What haunted the men below was not one bomb, but the knowledge that even after silence returned, another thin engine might already be coming. Near dawn, a German soldier sat in his foxhole and listened to a sky that had finally gone quiet. His helmet rested low on his head, his was pulled tight around his shoulders, and his eyes kept moving upward even though there was nothing to see. The smoke from a small fire drifted sideways in the pale light, and somewhere behind the line, a man coughed like he had been awake for too long. The night seemed finished, but he did not trust it. It had lied before. The strange power of the Night Witch did not come from overwhelming force. Their aircraft were not the largest, their bombs were not the heaviest, and their attacks did not always leave great destruction behind. A soldier could look at the small crater beside a tent and tell himself it was not much. He could look at the damaged boards, the scattered dirt, and the broken sleep around him, and still try to call it a minor raid. His body knew better. A single shock can pass through a man and leave him trembling, but a repeated threat works differently. It settles into the nerves. It teaches the body to wait for danger, even when no danger has appeared yet. It makes ordinary silence feel loaded, and it turns every distant sound into something that needs to be judged quickly. The soldier in the foxhole was not only listening to the morning, he was listening to a memory. It is almost cruel that the Night Witches did not have to dominate the battlefield to take away one of the few things soldiers still needed: the belief that darkness meant rest. That belief mattered more than it might seem. Men at the front could endure hunger, cold, fear, and bad orders if they were allowed few broken hours to recover. But when the night itself became uncertain, the whole body began to weaken. The darkness no longer covered them, it watched them. For German soldiers, the problem was not only that a bomb might fall, it was that the bomb might fall after the engine disappeared. It might fall after they had just lain down. It might fall from a direction they had not guessed. It might be followed by another aircraft, or by nothing at all, which was sometimes just as hard to bear because waiting kept the nerves alive. The threat did not need to appear every minute. It only needed to be possible. The women flying the Po-2 understood this pressure through the work itself. They returned again and again because repetition was the weapon. A single aircraft could disturb one position, but repeated night flights could make a whole camp sleep lightly, move slowly, and wake angry. The small bomb load did not cancel the effect, it shaped the method. What they lacked in weight, they replaced with persistence. Today, people might think safety returns when the noise stops, but for those men, the silence after a raid could feel like a door left open for the next one. That is what made harassment so exhausting. The soldier could not fully relax after surviving the first pass. His ears kept searching, his hands stayed near his helmet. His mind replayed the engine, the sudden quiet, and the blast that followed. Even dawn did not cleanly remove it. The sky had changed meaning. A low wind across the camp could make men pause. A vehicle starting behind the line could make a tired soldier turn too quickly. A distant engine could pull several faces upward at once, even before anyone knew whether it belonged to friend, enemy, or imagination. This was how fear became a habit rather than a moment. It no longer needed an explosion to wake the body. The body woke itself. I find it unsettling that the most lasting damage was sometimes not the crater, but the way men began carrying the night inside them after the night had already ended. Their faces in the morning showed it plainly. Red eyes, slow hands, short tempers, and the dull look of men who had stopped expecting sleep to heal them. A soldier might eat without tasting much, answer an order too late, or stare at the sky while another man spoke to him. Nothing about him looked heroic. He looked worn down. This was the kind of pressure that turned small raids into a larger psychological weight. German soldiers had to pay attention to the sky when they wanted to spend time resting. They had to keep weapons, boots, and helmet ready because being comfortable felt dangerous. They had to wake for alarms that sometimes led to blasts and sometimes led only to more waiting. Even the false alarm had value for the attacker because it stole peace. The Night Witches made the night active. Their courage and danger were tied to the same pattern. While German soldiers feared the return of the aircraft, the women had to make that return real by leaving their own field again, entering cold cockpits, reading dark ground, and trusting fragile machines. The fear below was not created cheaply. It was paid for by exhaustion above, by crews who kept flying after their hands were numb and their eyes had been strained by too many hours of darkness. The two sides met in sleeplessness. Near the foxhole, the German soldier finally lowered his gaze from the sky. Morning light had spread across the ground, revealing the small crater, the dirty blankets, the torn edge of a tent, and men moving slowly toward the day's work. Nothing looked like a great battlefield victory. But the tiredness in the camp was real, and the fear of the next night had already begun before the sun had fully risen. That was the deeper defeat. The Night Witches terrified Nazi soldiers not because their aircraft were the strongest, but because they returned often enough to make the night itself feel unsafe. The final part will look back at their story without treating them as ghosts or legends, but as young women who turned weakness, cold, repetition, and discipline into a weapon. In the end, the clearest image is not a fairy tale about witches, but old Po-2 aircraft lifting from mud while exhausted, enemies below learned to fear sleep itself. An old Po-2 sitting on a muddy field says more about the Night Witches than any polished legend. Beside it, a pair of cold flying gloves, a folded map, a pencil worn down by mission notes, and a runway marked by wheels in wet earth show the real shape of their war. The aircraft does not look powerful, and the field does not look heroic. But together they tell the story of women who used what little they had and made it matter. The night ahead was always larger than the machine. That is where the lesson begins. War often teaches people to look for strength in the biggest weapons. Heavy bombers, fast fighters, loud artillery, armoured vehicles, and great formations are easier to notice because they change the landscape in obvious ways. The Night Witches force us to look at a different kind of power, one built from patience, repetition, memory, teamwork, discipline, and the willingness to return to danger after the body has already been pushed too far. Their aircraft was weak by many measures, but their method was not weak. It was persistent. The women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later honoured as the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, they did not become memorable because they looked like a perfect myth. They became memorable because the plain truth was already strong enough. Young women flew old biplanes in darkness, crossed dangerous ground, dealt with cold wind in open cockpits, faced searchlights and gunfire, and returned often enough to make German soldiers fear the hours when they should have been resting. That is not a fairy tale. That is work. It is almost strange that history needed a supernatural nickname for women whose real achievement was already difficult enough without magic. The name Night Witches is powerful, but it can also hide the human bodies inside the story. A witch sounds distant, unreal, almost untouched by pain. These women were not untouched. Their hands went numb, their eyes burned, their faces were cut by cold air, and their minds had to stay clear after nights of broken rest. Their courage had skin, breath, fatigue, and fear inside it. That matters. Their effect on the German side also teaches something about fear in war. Fear does not always come from one great explosion or one decisive attack. Sometimes it comes from being disturbed again and again until sleep becomes uncertain. A small bomb can leave a small crater, but if it wakes a whole camp, pulls men from blankets, forces them to listen for the next engine, and leaves them exhausted by morning, its effect is larger than the hole in the ground. The damage spreads inward. German soldiers feared them not only because they might die, but because they might survive another night without rest. Red eyes, slow hands, short tempers, bad judgment, and the constant habit of looking up at the sky became part of the pressure. The Night Witches turned darkness into a battlefield, and they made silence feel suspicious. In that way, they attacked the mind as much as the body. Today, people often measure danger by visible destruction, but this story shows how exhaustion, anxiety, and repeated interruption can weaken human beings without leaving many dramatic marks. That is one of the most important truths here. A ruined building is easy to understand. A broken aircraft is easy to photograph. A soldier losing his ability to rest, think, and recover is quieter. But on a battlefield, it can be just as serious. The women paid for that pressure too. They did not stand outside the suffering they created. To make German soldiers lose sleep, they lost their own. To make the enemy fear the silent sky, they entered that sky in fragile machines. To turn weakness into a weapon, they had to accept the weakness first, then learn how to use it with discipline. Their strength did not come from pretending the Po-2 was powerful. It came from understanding exactly what it could do. They used limits carefully. The Po-2 was slow, light, and old, but it could fly from rough fields, moved low in darkness, and return repeatedly. The open cockpit was cruel, but the aircraft was simple enough to keep working under harsh conditions. The bomb load was small, but small loads could become repeated harassment. The machine was not ideal, yet the women shaped its flaws into a method. That is why the story still has force. I find it deeply human that their greatness came not from having everything they needed, but from refusing to let what they lacked become the end of the story. They were doubted, under-equipped, exposed to the weather, and placed in danger night after night. They still built a record large enough to survive the war in memory. Many were honoured, many endured, and some did not return. Their legacy carries pride, but it also carries grief. The field at dawn holds both. A pilot standing beside a Po-2 as the sky begins to lighten does not need to look triumphant for the scene to be powerful. Her coat is heavy with damp air, her scarf is tight around her neck, and mud clings to her boots. The aircraft behind her looks worn, patched, and too small for the story people will later tell about it. Yet it flew, she flew, and somewhere beyond the line, men who had mocked such machines learned to fear their return. That is the real lesson. The Night Witches were not terrifying because they were witches. They were terrifying because they made persistence into a weapon. It showed that war is not only shaped by machines that crush, but also by small repeated acts that deny the enemy rest, comfort, certainty, and calm. They showed that courage can be quiet, muddy, cold, and repeated until the world is forced to notice. So when we remember them, it is better not to flatten them into a simple legend. They were not ghosts in the sky. They were women in old aircraft, using memory, coordination, discipline, and endurance against an enemy that wanted to sleep and could not. Their story deserves respect because it is more powerful as truth than as myth, and with that, we leave the muddy airfield, the cold cockpit, the thin engine sound, and the frightened men listening from below. Thank you for staying with this story until the end, and may the night around you be far kinder than the nights these women flew through. Sleep well, rest safely, and good night.